Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on environmental justice on environmental human rights. My name is Sophie Loeb, and I'm a policy analyst for the climate justice team. I'm going to run through a few announcements before we begin. If you have problems with the webinar audio on your computer, you can call in by phone using the information provided here, which we'll add to the chat box in just a second. Just a heads up, all audience members will be muted during the webinar to cut down on background noise. If you have any questions during the discussion, please type them into the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. The Q&A will begin at 1:45. At the end of the event, we'll close with information on additional resources and ways you can get involved. Finally, this discussion will be recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel, and a link will be sent to everyone who registered for the webinar and shared on social media. There will be a slight pause now while we begin recording.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Environmental Justice as Environmental Human Rights. I'm Sid Shapiro. I am the Frank U. Fletcher Chair in Administrative Law at Wake Forest University and a member scholar of the Center for Progressive Reform. The center is a think and do tank with a network of more than 60 member scholars working to build thriving communities on a resilient planet. We drive policy reform with rigorous and accessible legal analysis designed for change makers. We're honored today to be joined by several experts in the field of environmental law and climate equity. And before we begin today's discussion, please allow me to briefly introduce them. First, I want to introduce Carlos Claussell, a climate change professional with over 10 years experience driving community-centered processes at the local, state, and national level. Recently, Mr. Claussell served as the vice chair of the City of Philadelphia's Environmental Justice Advocacy Advisory Commission, where he advised the mayor and the city council and advocated for environmental justice communities in the city. He's currently serving as the Climate and Environmental Justice Manager at the World Wildlife Fund. Next, I want to introduce Monique Harden, the Director of Law and Policy and the Community Engagement Program Manager at the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. The center provides research, education, and community engagement support to predominantly Black communities in the Gulf Coast region. Ms. Harden is also the former co-director of Advocates for Environmental Human Rights, the public interest law firm that established the precedent for environmental racism as an international human rights violation. May I also introduce my colleague, John Knox, the Henry C. Lauerman Professor of International Law at Wake Forest University. From 2012 to 2018, Professor Knox served in the United Nations on the issue of human rights obligations to a clean and healthy environment. With Nicole Tronolone, he co-authored the paper on environmental justice as environmental human rights that occasioned our webinar today. He's also a member scholar of the center. Dr. Lemir Teron is an associate professor at Howard University's Department of Earth, Environment, and Equity, and he holds a PhD in energy and environmental policy. He serves on the Energy Working Group of the New York State Climate Impacts Assessment and is the founder of Unlearn Power, an energy justice project. Dr. Teron recently contributed to our symposium on environmental human rights and is a member scholar of CPR. So what we're going to do today, until it's time for the questions, is have some questions for the panelists. I will ask them to any panelist, and some or all of the panelists will respond, and then we'll move on to a new question. So we'll start with this question. How would you describe the status quo of environmental policy in the United States? And in particular, why haven't environmental justice efforts at the federal level been successful? What are the limits or failures you've encountered in your work? And perhaps we can start with John to give him a chance to talk a little more about his article.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Sid. And thanks to CPR for organizing this and to everyone else for participating in it and being in here. I'll try and be brief on this because I know the other panelists, I'm sure, have a lot to say about this as well. But I think the status quo of environmental policy in the United States is in some ways that it's stuck. Environmental policy and law in the United States haven't really changed very much in some ways in the last 30 or 35 years since the last major amendment to the U.S. Clean Air Act. In my article, I try and evaluate U.S. environmental policy and law according to international human rights standards. And I find that in a lot of ways, it matches up okay, or even pretty well. That is, environmental human rights standards require, for example, that people have the right to know about environmental problems, they have the right to participate in environmental policy, that they have the right to access to remedies. U.S. law does a pretty good job in all of those things. There's a huge problem, though, a huge gap, which has been part of environmental law in the United States really since the beginning, which is the failure to adequately address environmental justice issues. Environmental racism goes pretty much unaddressed as a matter of U.S. environmental law, despite the fact that it's quite clearly in violation of international human rights law, and I think should be considered a violation of U.S. Constitutional law and U.S. civil rights law as well. By the problem of environmental racism and environmental justice, I'm simply referring to the fact that environmental harm in the United States disproportionately affects racialized minorities and marginalized communities, as it does pretty much everywhere in the world. The problem of disproportionate environmental harm adversely affecting the most marginalized communities in a society is really a hallmark of discrimination and marginalization in pretty much every country in the world that I examined when I was working at, as the UN Special Rapporteur on these issues. In our article, we give many examples of it. Many other people have firsthand experience with some of these examples, or many of them. We describe Cancer Alley in Louisiana. We describe the problem of proximity of African American communities to giant hog waste operations in southeastern North Carolina. We describe Flint and so forth. In terms of why these problems persist and what exactly the legal shortcomings are, I think the short answer is that neither environmental law nor civil rights law in the United States has ever really come to grips with these problems. Environmental law in the United States doesn't address discrimination really at all. It assumes simply that if we lower overall levels of environmental harm, that benefits will be evenly distributed, which is just not true. And civil rights law doesn't address the problem very well at all, largely because of restrictive interpretations of civil rights law in the 14th Amendment by the U.S. Supreme Court. Since the Supreme Court has required that to show discrimination, you have to show evidence of intent, racial animus on the part of government officials somehow, it's extraordinarily difficult ever to prove environmental racism to that standard. It's very difficult to show that a government official in Louisiana or North Carolina or wherever has intended to treat people differently because of their race, even if that may be the case. The problem is simply that environmental racism is a problem of systemic racism. And the fact that, for example, sources of pollution are disproportionately located in Black communities isn't necessarily due to explicit racial animus, but that doesn't change the fact that those communities bear a disproportionate burden because of built-in racism built into the system. And as we can discuss in a lot more detail, our civil rights laws simply don't provide a good answer to that. At least they have not been interpreted as providing a good answer for those kinds of problems.
Thank you, John. Would others like to weigh in?
Yeah, hi, I'll weigh in. Again, my name is Monique Harden, and I'm an attorney in Louisiana, live in New Orleans, and work at the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. The founder and executive director of the organization is Dr. Beverly Wright, who was one of hundreds of people who formulated a call to action for environmental and economic justice back in 1991. And that, along with that call to action, there was the principles of environmental justice were declared. And there are some 17 principles in all by indigenous advocates, Black, Latino, Asian American, Pacific Islander advocates coming together at the first leadership summit, People of Color Leadership Summit back in Washington, D.C. In these 17 principles of environmental justice, a focus on principle 10 is this articulation of environmental injustice as a violation of human rights. The work I've committed myself to doing since law school has been around trying to find and establish a remedy for this appalling fact that race is the single most determining factor of pollution in the United States and around the world. If you explore the ways in which this comes out through a system of laws that essentially codify the status quo of industrial operations. And so the consequences, as some people would call the externalities of all of that, are just not regarded in our system. And the failure to address this adds to the problem and complexities of this human rights violation that really have metastasized to this climate crisis we're all living under. The same companies that initially denied nosebleeds suffered by children in community frontline communities, or denied asthma or denied cancer and reproductive damage, are the same companies that have denied climate change. And so these sources of pollution that's in our communities are also the same sources that's warming the planet. And being able to, what will it take for all of us to come together to say something must be done about it? Human rights law really provides a shield for our communities, but the remedies that can come forward from it are limited. And so that's a problem that we all live with and try to struggle to work on. And there's some strategies that have been used over the decades that I can get into later.
Let me ask this question. We've addressed the question and sort of the sad story of the federal level. What are the lessons from states or places like Puerto Rico? Are there developments locally that we should follow that are instructive or give us information about the kinds of gaps you just heard described?
Thank you, Sid. I'm going to contribute from both personal and professional experiences and perspectives around the topic, and connecting it to the original question, like why environmental justice or environmental policies at the federal level haven't been successful. I would argue, when have they been successful is when communities, grassroots organizations, local actors have been pushing for action, have been providing solutions, have been advocating for addressing a lot of this environmental and health burdens that environmental justice communities face and have faced. And there are plenty of examples of bottom-up solutions, calls to action, and strategies and implementation strategies for addressing these issues. And when you look at the broad or the current national policy landscape around environmental and climate justice, a lot of these solutions across decades from local action have successfully informed a lot of the frameworks that we are seeing or using right now to begin to deal with these issues, which are still very, very big issues that we still haven't tackled as a whole of society, but we see how these policies are being advanced through local community-led action. In the case of Puerto Rico, in terms of examples, we've seen recently community-led action to identify and address violation of federal law and state and local law around natural resources, especially around the coastal areas. About 60% of the people in Puerto Rico live around coastal areas, and a lot of environmental degradation, a lot of development oriented towards tourism and the tourist economy has caused significant impact towards the environment and the communities living in those ecosystems, and are the communities themselves that are bringing to state and federal agencies the basically the cases to go ahead and enact these policies, make sure that environmental resource and natural resources and the communities themselves are being protected in accordance to law.
I'll hop in. Once again, Lemir Teron, thank you all for joining today, and I'm happy to be with you. In terms of what states are doing, as was mentioned in my introduction, I've been working the past several years with New York State on its climate impacts assessment. And not to say New York State has been perfect, far from it, but it's been a leader, just thinking about its work in the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, where it carved out specific language around benefits up to 40 or a targeted goal of 40% of benefits going to so-called disadvantaged communities. Now, the problem was when they created the language of disadvantaged communities, they didn't define what that was. You ultimately saw that policy infused into the Justice 40 initiative. But I want to make sure I go back to the very first question, if I can just have another minute or so. First off, I'm glad we foregrounded this conversation. I've already heard the word, the phrase, environmental racism several times, and it's important to use that language because a lot of times we use environmental justice and we'll say EJ, and those things almost sound melodic, right? But when you're talking about environmental racism, I think you're automatically alert and you're thinking, man, there's need for some level of resistance. But just in terms of has environmental policy, the status quo met or done what it needed to do, I think that there's probably not a person on this call that thinks that the environmental policy status quo is commensurate with the threats we're facing. If you look at federal level or state level climate policy, does anybody think that that's commensurate with the rising GHGs and the extreme weather events that we're seeing, whether you're talking about temperature or flooding, food policy? Are we anywhere near to having, food equality across the country where people are eating healthy and safe and affordable meals multiple times a day? And then finally, just thinking about it's not all bad, doom and gloom. A lot of the work I do is related to urban forestry. Federal government just recently put $1 billion into environmental justice, so-called environmental justice communities across the country so that we can have equitable, safe, healthy urban forest. And urban forests just aren't about building trees and having pretty ecoscapes. A lot of environmental benefits. We're thinking about food forests. We're thinking about air quality remediation. Certainly, we're thinking about the effects that forests can have on extreme heat and urban heat islands.
Thank you. When I read John's article originally, one of the ideas that popped into my head, I started thinking about the potential for using this gap and using the language of international human rights, environmental human rights, as a tool of advocacy in the United States. Perhaps, John, you could start us off by suggesting what do we gain, hopefully, by incorporating this information about human rights? What does it give us, perhaps, that we don't already have to get moving finally?
Yeah, so I guess I should start by making clear that I don't want to portray international human rights norms as a kind of panacea. There's no world environmental enforcement agency or, I don't know, human rights police or something that can kind of swoop in, even if there is a violation of a pretty clear international human rights norm, and kind of make everything all right. So in that sense, it can be frustrating to, even if you feel like you can put something in international human rights terms, make a strong case, as Monique did, for example, in the Mossville case, it can still not feel like it actually results in a concrete outcome for your situation. Having said that, though, I want to emphasize two things that I think it does provide that may not otherwise exist. One is it can provide recourse to clear standards that are much friendlier to claims of environmental injustice and racism than U.S. law often is. Perhaps most important, international human rights law prohibits laws and policies that have discriminatory effects, even if you can't show evidence of discriminatory intent. Moreover, these laws, these human rights norms have become more and more detailed and well understood internationally over the last 10 or 15 years. Again, in my work at the UN, I kind of had a front row seat to this development. There are just immense, exciting events occurring in the field of environment and human rights all around the world at the international level and in other countries. Environmental human rights law, therefore, gives you a shared language that U.S. advocates can use and U.S. scholars can use in engaging in these kinds of activities, these kinds of developments with people from other countries and at the international level. So that's one advantage, I think. A second advantage is it also provides forums that go beyond just those of U.S. courts and administrative agencies. These forums include UN bodies that oversee compliance with human rights treaties, that can receive complaints and issue reports on violations or just overall assessments. Again, UN special rapporteurs have issued reports on the United States. They were involved, for example, in criticizing the United States for the Dakota Access Pipeline. Again, these reports and investigations aren't necessarily going to be legally binding. Again, I want to emphasize that. But at the same time, especially when combined with domestic advocacy, they may still be able to have real effects. They can raise awareness of these issues. They can place pressure on governments to respond. And again, they provide ways to link up with advocates in other countries. Again, what we call environmental justice in the United States is basically environmental human rights internationally. And so being clear about that enables you to have clearer, let's say, modalities for cooperation and advocacy and drawing on the experiences of people and advocates in other countries as well.
Monique, you mentioned early on that this has been part of your concern and advocacy going back to 1991. Could you talk a little bit about what John was just saying?
Sure. There's a community in Southwest Louisiana called Mossville. It's a community that was founded by some accounts before the Civil War by Black families who settled in the area after emancipating themselves from slavery. And following the Civil War, the community grew. And it was this tight-knit enclave of Black families in an area that was just blessed with rich ecosystem where they could fish, they could grow fruits and vegetables, they could hunt, and they were able to build their livelihoods on that ecosystem of bayous and very fertile soil. And it was later a place that was targeted for industrial development going back to the late 1930s. And that industrial development grew to the point where the descendants of Mossville were surrounded by 14 toxic industrial facilities, including the largest concentration of vinyl manufacturing facilities in the US. So they had, oil refining, plastic production, gas production facilities all around them, and across the street from some of the homes where Mossville residents lived. After joining an effort to have their blood tested for toxic chemicals and learning that they were exposed to high levels of cancer-causing chemicals and hormone-disrupting chemicals like dioxins, there was a focus on, calling for a governmental response from our U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry. And while there was some response from those agencies, it was more the study without end kind of a response. And in the midst, some of the people who had been tested had died. Some of the families just moved on their own because of serious problems that their children were suffering. And so we were at our wits' end as to, what to do about this, and recognizing that, but for the decision to permit these facilities in the communities of Mossville, there would be no crisis in terms of their health, and their future. And so we filed this human rights petition with the Organization of American States against the US government for enacting environmental laws that don't protect the environment, but actually harm our communities. And we found violations that we presented in the petition under the Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Man, American Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Man, on the violation of the right to freedom from racial discrimination, the right to health and life, the right to privacy as it relates to the security of one's home. And we filed this with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And one of the biggest hurdles we had with the petition was to show that it was admissible. And you have to overcome the presumption that there is a remedy in the country where in this case, in the United States. And we were able to really make quick work of showing that there's no remedy for the environmental racism suffered in the Mossville community for generations. And we were able to win this have a ruling in our favor on admissibility that found that environmental racism in the United States is a human rights violation. The remedies that Mossville residents demanded that were in the petition included a moratorium on further pollution being permitted in the community, a cleanup of toxic sites, relocation for residents that would be voluntary, among them their choice, not forced on them, and a health clinic for residents who remained, and other improvements to their environmental conditions. Soon after we received the admissibility ruling, there was an effort underway to relocate Mossville residents, and which mooted the case. But it was an opportunity to really put on trial, if you will, the system of environmental regulation and laws that really don't work for communities, but actually target communities for toxic pollution. And it's called the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, but the more you spend time with it, the more Orwellian those titles are, because they really allow for air to be polluted and water to be polluted and contaminated by their workings, by their essential reliance on maintaining industrial operations.
Thank you. As we're all aware, the areas of environmental law and energy law have been co-joined and overlapping as we try to address climate change. And it appears that yet another venue for these issues of environmental justice and environmental racism is in the energy field. Lemir, I know you're working on that. Others may be. Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so you can't decouple energy justice and environmental justice. And when we're talking about energy justice, we need to be talking about a bunch of things. As some of our colleagues have previously said, the burdens that fence line communities are facing that are more often than not, or many times racialized, Black folks suffering the brunt of living next to petrochemical facilities. We got to talk about energy transitions where people have access to work and livelihoods that are commensurate with 21st century health standards and pay livable wages. We got to talk about inequitable energy burdens. Black households, Native households, Latina households paying extraordinary sums on average in terms of their take-home pay, going towards monthly energy bills. we also got to globalize these conversations. We got to ask questions in terms of life cycle assessment. Where are we getting products from? And when we think about the interrogation that we have with the status quo fossilized energy system, we gotta hold the energy transition and renewable energy systems up to that same degree of interrogation. So what we're saying is, from extraction all the way to retirement, we need to have safe work. We need to be asking questions: do workers have access to unionization? Are people getting paid living wages? And we need to have energy transitions that are democratized, where local communities are making decisions about what transitions and what renewable energy objectives are meaningful for their communities.
Carlos, in your work in Philadelphia, have you seen this range of issues we've just been talking about?
I want to comment on Lemir said, and also tied to the previous question on environmental and human rights lens. A lot of the environmental policies that we often are engaging with, dealing with, as Monique mentioned, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, are also very much informed and sustained by more conventional environmental conservation principles and philosophies, in which is the conservation, preservation of certain plots of land, natural spaces and resources, mostly for certain practices, but with a detachment of society, local communities, of people and their needs and their benefits from environmental efforts. And what we're seeing from a human rights conditioning of putting the environmental policies and the framing of environmental action from a more people-centered and community-centered lens, in which we obviously identify the harms that certain industrial and standard practices that we are aware of utilizing natural resources have an impact towards local communities, often Black and brown communities, but also seeing that when certain elements of pollution are we seek to reduce those harms or those issues, we don't necessarily see benefits for local communities, Black and brown communities. So what Lemir was mentioning is, like, how can we also, as we seek to address the harms related to pollution of water, of land, of air, and we seek to reduce those harms, how, when we invest, when we allocate resources to address those issues, we're also building a pathway towards benefits for local communities that are economic mobility, workforce and related, are etc. A lot of these examples that we see that are very much tied to more of an international philosophies around engagement between communities and the environment is, for example, we're seeing community land trusts and the ways that communities have ownership and are stakeholders of what happens, what is being done to the land, or to the land where they live, or nearby where they live. So we're seeing a lot of efforts to actually acknowledge communities as stakeholders and allow them to be part of the decision-making processes that not only seek to reduce those harms, but also produce benefits, instead of for the standard stakeholders that we often see. We're tied to business development and industries, etc., but also making sure that those benefits also produce social, economic, and environmental benefits for fence-line communities, frontline communities, Black and brown communities.
Here's a.
Can I just add?
Please, absolutely, please.
Yeah, and Carlson, so the way in which we work on it at the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice is that the work around an energy transition needs to be equitable, and it also needs to be held to human rights standards, so that we're not, we've got a bit of U.S. history that we could look to, especially in the South, when it comes to economic transitions. And that was, going from slavery to sharecropping system, right? And so that same brutal oppression was still woven in this new form of economic development, if you will. And so being able to ensure that a just transition is that, and holding it to those human rights standards, is vital. And I just wanted to add that to what you were saying. We do it in a way in which it's informed and led by community-based organizations, and we support and collaborate with education, research, and capacity building to help them achieve their goals around We have a project here in New Orleans where we, through a bottom-up approach that began with education, we're able to build the first mandatory renewable and equitable energy mandate in the city of New Orleans, and it's the first in the Southeast. This is requiring that electricity supply to New Orleans come from non-carbon sources of energy, but also supports and benefits low-income communities so that you're not in a situation that can arise where the prospects of benefiting from this new energy system is out of reach or inaccessible or too costly. So those, I think tying that human rights work doesn't go away. It's part of that transition work as well. So thanks.
I want to add, Sid, to your comment, to a question around Philly. Talking again about examples, Philadelphia has arguably one of the best or most comprehensive municipal plans programs to advance solar residential infrastructure development. Solarize Philly, for example, and a lot of things you're seeing around these programs that are community and people-centered strategies from bottom up. You're also seeing how through the development of that program, a lot of issues arose with the conditions of a lot of infrastructure and the conditions of the homes that prevented such programs to be installed, implemented in low-income, low-wealth communities around the region. Therefore, seeing how elected officials, through engagement with community-based organizations and local action, then enacted state-level policies like whole homes to make sure that there are public resources that allows low-income, low-wealth families to access public funding to retrofit their homes so that not only they have a safe and secure home to live in, but also that home is now ready to be to receive investments and benefit from solarized systems to retrofit their homes. So therefore, you're improving their quality of life in multiple ways by improving their internal conditions in their homes, but also making sure that they are part of a just transition towards clean energy action, and making sure that we divest our dependency on fossil fuel related energy production.
I have one more question, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience, because we have some good ones. And I remind anybody in the audience, if you'd like to file a question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, I'll be able to see it, and I'll get to as many questions as possible. But for a final question, how is the Biden administration doing regarding what we have been talking about? And are we seeing something different from President Biden than we've seen from previous administrations?
I'll jump in. Compared to previous administrations, at least in terms of language, and to a degree action, I think it's been stronger, but let's be real, life is not lived on paper. And just because you use terms like economic or environmental justice or disadvantaged communities, I think if we're not focused on this call and beyond this call on what are the outcomes looking like, then I think we're doing ourselves a great disservice. So when you're critiquing that administration or any administration, language matters. What's the end game for farm workers? Are we reducing or totally truncating impacts and exposures to carcinogens? What's the end game for climate policy? Once again, if you go back to what I said a couple comments ago, does our climate policy, is it commensurate with the challenge that we're going to be faced with over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years? I think hopefully anybody in this call will say status quo. Absolutely not. When you think about petrochemical exposures, we have some beautiful tools that have been developed and enhanced over the last few years. But just because we've democratized tools, climate and economic justice screening tools, we have things like EJ Screen, we have more visibility and transparency and information. The only thing I'm concerned about is outcomes and end games. So I think that is where your report card is ultimately, or that's how you're ultimately going to have to critique this administration and any administration.
Thank you.
Yeah, can
others,
I add?
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Sure. So Lemir spoke a little earlier about the Justice 40 initiative. And I think that's been a very important opportunity for communities across the country to be able to lead the way in investing in their priorities that can benefit and things from affordable, sustainable housing, dealing with legacy pollution and remediation, climate justice, renewable energy, being among the areas for investment that can support and sustain the work that they have going forward. And so with that Justice 40 initiative, I count that as a extreme positive. Along with that is the leadership at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Michael Regan, an appointee of President Biden, leading that agency, and accepting for investigation civil rights complaints in Louisiana, communities of St. John, St. James, that he personally visited as part of a multi-state journey to justice that he led at the beginning of the administration, and coming to the communities and then coming back with the civil rights investigation that produced an agreement with our state health and state environmental agencies that would have really been transformative, but for a lawsuit filed by our state government to put the kibosh on that investigation. Which was a civil rights investigation. And so I think when you're looking at opportunities and positive developments that have come out of the administration, one step forward is met with a hammer, and that needs to that involves struggle to try to get it across the finish line. And we're right in the midst of that civil rights struggle in the state of Louisiana. One minus I would give to the administration is the support of carbon capture and storage. Which is an unproven technology. Well, actually, it's proven to fail. It's a failed technology for removing carbon emissions from an industrial facility, transporting it interstate over pipeline for underground injection, which has never been done on a permanent disposal basis. And this is a hazardous material we're talking that, it creates tremendous risks and hazards for communities, and also opens the door for more fossil fuel burning, more oil and gas burning, as opposed to lessening or reducing that in the face of this climate crisis.
I would echo what Monique said, centering Justice 40, but not only the Justice 40 policy initiative that seeks to deliver at least 40% of the overall benefits around climate and environment towards disadvantaged communities, we're talking about the footprint of disadvantaged communities per federal government. We're talking about 109 million people. That's a third of the U.S. population. And another thing is to know how would that actually become a reality. But having that policy is extremely important. But not only that, how that policy is also embedded in key federal investments and policies coming from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and other federal investments that are at least putting guardrails and provisions around public funds, federal funds, to make sure that those funds build that pathway towards providing benefits for disadvantaged communities as it is being framed. Other things, when we think in compared to the previous federal administration, denying climate change, taking the country as a whole out of the Paris agreements and its international commitments was a significant step back. So being back in having an administration that acknowledges that climate change and climate action is important and at least does takes meaningful steps to begin to build that pathway towards addressing climate change is a really important thing that should be something that shouldn't be partisan. It should be sustained by any future administration, as well as the Justice 40 initiative. That is something that I think understanding how Justice 40, how bipartisan infrastructure law, how IRA and all these resources and other policies around climate are sustained regardless to who's in power is extremely important for this administration and for future administrations as well.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with some questions from the audience. We just heard from Monique that EPA abandoned its civil rights initiative in Louisiana after the state sued. And it appears they did that in part because they were afraid of going to the Supreme Court with that case because of something John talked about early, which is the elimination or the difficulty of using disparate impacts as a basis for civil rights complaints. John, I think I'll address this to you because it also deals with the Supreme Court. The question is, what reception do you expect for these arguments about international human rights at the U.S. Supreme Court? I recall Anthony Kennedy making this connection, but I don't know what to expect from the current Supreme Court.
I think you can expect complete rejection of any arguments based on human rights or any, for that matter, any civil rights arguments in this context. I'm afraid the Supreme Court, unless and until its membership is changed, is basically a kind of, reactionary oppositional force to everything that we're talking about here. So I don't want to give anyone any false hope about that. I think there are some interesting developments in other courts. The Montana Supreme Court, or I'm sorry, I misspoke. The Montana District Court, trial court, issued a really important decision last year based on the right to a healthy environment enshrined in the Montana Constitution in the context of climate change. The famous Juliana case is still puttering along in district court, although I think it would not survive review by the Supreme Court if it ever made it that far. But there are some rights-based approaches that are having some traction in court. I guess I would emphasize, though, that for lawyers and advocates in this space, we really need to think beyond litigation. That a lot of the ways in which you might be able to use rights-based approaches to address environmental racism, environmental injustice generally, have to look beyond the courts, because in a lot of ways the courts are really not very friendly right now. Or at least the federal courts are not very friendly right now to these kinds of arguments.
Thank you. This is a kind of a comparative question that any or all the panelists can weigh in on, which is have some states been more successful in addressing environmental justice, or are the forces involved so widespread that only federal intervention can be effective?
Yeah, I think when you take a tour around the country, you see a lot of things on the state and local level. I'm based out of DC these days. If you're interested in energy justice and in fighting against energy inequality, take a look at DC's sustainable energy utility. And it's not just about renewable energy trinkets, it's also about weatherization. You're going to need both strategies, right? We're going to need to switch to renewables, but we're also going to have to do a better job with weatherizing homes to make sure that people are secure during some of these brutal winters. Take a look at New York State's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. California, thinking about California's banned the construction of interstates near schools. And you may think, man, that's just a hyper-local example, but just think about the other states. And New York State just resisted similar legislation. So in the 21st century, we're still building interstates and all the pernicious and toxic air, noise pollution, and all the things that comes with, elevated blood pressure, et cetera, next to schools and communities. So a lot of good examples from places all around the country.
I would add to that, looking at the states that have actually enacted, approved climate policies and legislation is the first place to look at. And I would add to what Lemir mentioned on Illinois' Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. It's an interesting piece of state level legislation that connects action around climate and clean energy transition with workforce development and prioritizing disadvantaged communities, or how the state defines disadvantaged communities, EJ communities. I think they use a specific term that I don't remember right now, but it's an interesting state level legislation that look and see how climate justice, environmental justice, and equity provisions are part of the overall state objectives.
When you were answering questions, there was a discussion and kind of an emphasis on the role of grassroots groups, community organizing. And there are a couple of questions that members of the audience have filed to think more broadly about how we take advantage and build those efforts, and maybe those efforts respond to John's observation that as lawyers, we need to think more broadly than litigation, and particularly civil rights litigation. And these kinds of community efforts and grassroots efforts, is that a response to the sort of failure of litigation?
I think the community grassroots efforts is an all of the above approach, right? And so it's actually spurred environmental justice litigation, whether it's using civil rights law, human rights law, or existing conventional environmental laws to achieve these ends. But it's not limited to litigation, right? The education and research work we do at the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice with community-based organizations has led to the denial of not one, but 3 permits for construction and debris landfills in Pensacola, Florida, where the Escambia County Board of Commissioners were convinced by community members using the skill sets that they've learned around collecting and researching their own data and being able to map these issues of flood impact from these permit decisions. Being able to show that blind spot in the decision making resulted in the denial of the permit renewals, but it also opened the door by the County Board of Commissioners to do 2 things that we did not expect, but we're really happy for. One was to change their governmental structure to include an environmental justice community advisory committee to their decision making and working with their environmental office. 1. 2, to revise their standards for permitting to incorporate these community impacts that were shown at the hearing in which they denied the permits. That's just one example of many where being able to support communities in building their power to pursue and achieve their solutions is integral. I mean, that's where a lot of investment should go, but that does not cut off legal strategies and litigation or policy opportunities that ultimately this works on, right? Because the environmental justice decisions that came from Escambia are really policy changes that the community was able to achieve. So more, please, of that.
Let me jump in 20 seconds. The legend, the hero, Bob Bullard. The goal of the environmental justice researcher professor is not to get tenure. The goal of the environmental justice researcher professor is to support environmental justice communities. That's where it starts. That's where it ends. I've hedged my professional bets on what we call public science, right? How do we co-produce, co-design, co-deliver environmental services, right? So expertise is not held within the cabal of the classroom. Yes, I love teaching at Howard University, but you're also going to catch me giving lectures at public libraries, with labor unions, with hard hats, forestry organizations. So we got to democratize, and we got to make these sacred things we're talking about today. We got to put those in the public space. We got to talk a little bit more, or a lot more, about ecology too. We haven't talked too much about ecology. What about the rights of nature? Where are ecosystems with all this? Yes, human-centric outcomes are important, but we also got to talk about ecology, because that's where it's at. And then finally, if I said anything compelling, I'm not selling anything on my website. If you want to know more about public science, take a look at my website, unlearnpower.org, or you just do a web search for Unlearn Power. Once again, I'm not selling, I'm not going to charge you a dime, but if you want to know what my lab looks like, if you want to know what my iteration of what public science looks like and community outreach and engagement, take a look at that site. You may find a couple of things that are compelling.
We have a question from a law student in Louisiana, and she would like us to think a little more about the role of community advisory groups, and are they really effective, and what makes them effective in shaping and shifting policy. This is advisory committees to boards, to the governor, Philadelphia, that sort of thing.
It depends. It depends. It's like saying, is marriage successful? Some are, some aren't. So this is just another, kind of human relationship. Where it works is where you have the hearers of that advice having some threshold agreements that the work is about justice. When you don't have that kind of commitment, it's more likely to be less successful.
Short question, Lemir, could you repeat the name of your website again?
Sure. Unlearnpower.org, or just do a web search for Unlearn Power and you should find me in the first or second hit.
So we're quickly closing in on the end of the seminar, which I'm sad to say because it's been so interesting. But we do have a couple minutes left. Would any of you like to enter some concluding thoughts? 1 minute final statement.
Just really briefly, I thought I would point people to the series of blog posts that the CPR published on this last fall, which includes some contributions by Lemir and me, as well as a lot of other folks. In particular, just to highlight one or two in particular, Uma Outgo wrote a blog post on the Louisiana suit to try and basically shut down the inquiry into environmental racism that we talked about. Carmen Gonzalez and Rebecca Bratsfies wrote a really interesting post about concrete things that environmental professors can do to make sure that they're actually incorporating environmental racism and justice into their classroom. And I think everyone would find a lot of the stuff that people posted there interesting. So I just encourage you to go back and look at that.
At the Deep South Center website, which is dscej.org, there's a report I would encourage folks to take a look at. The title is "The More Things Change, the More They Remain the Same, Living and Dying in Cancer Alley." And this is a report that comes after a report that was done by the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice in 1993 that was treated as though it was, heresy, which was to link environmental pollution to race, and showing that via maps and using geographic information systems to develop that report. And this is looking back at that report, but where we are today in Louisiana's Cancer Alley. And so the report, the title is "The More Things Change, the More They Remain the Same, Living and Dying in Cancer Alley." You can find it on our website at the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice.
Thank you. And the center has just posted a link to this blog symposium that John mentioned. Well, I think we're at the end here, or awfully close. So I'd like to thank our presenters.
I really want to say to folks that are attending this webinar, get engaged, deepen your engagement, get involved locally. It's important, and all of you have an amazing set of skill sets that will help advance this important critical work. So, and thank you for being already engaged.
And in that regard, good minds think alike. There's one final slide that somebody at the center is going to put up, talking about some opportunities to get further engaged and some additional information that people can get. Can we get that slide up? Or not? There we go. So there's the information, and people can check out the recording again. The best place to find most of that information is the Center website and the websites that you've heard referred to by all of our speakers. So once again, terrific conversation, and I thank you all very much. And I thank the audience for coming and learning and taking into account the need, which we just heard, to get out there and work.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.